Joining me now for analysis on the current state of affairs here in Australia and around the world is Australian newspapers editor-at-large Paul Kelly from Sydney. Parliament's back, Paul, as Trudy just covered off, but I'm keen for your assessment on how you think that things stand broadly at the moment in Canberra. We're a long way on from the national emergency circumstances of a couple of months ago. We saw politics winding back into the interactions today between the government and the opposition. I thought the PM looked very strong in question time. I think the opposition is still looking for a bit of relevance, but there's plenty of opportunities for them. There's still all the games being played out in terms of JobKeeper and childcare. What's your sense of it all?
I think to this point, Peter, the Morrison government has done very well in terms of managing these two crises, the health crisis and the economic crisis, and this is reflected in the polls. But things are about to get a lot more difficult for the government, because we are now facing the challenge of reopening the economy consistent with maintaining success on the health front. And this is going to be contingent upon a new economic reform agenda. And economic reform, we know, is difficult. Scott Morrison's indicated he wants a fairly ambitious and wide-ranging economic reform. He signalled training and skills. He signalled industrial relations. And Christian Porter has begun that process, but it will also include taxation reform, energy, infrastructure, manufacturing in the regions. And the government will also be faced, of course, with the end of the JobKeeper arrangements in terms of their across-the-board application in September and facing higher levels of unemployment at that stage. So there's no doubt the challenge in future months will be serious for the government.
I want to look at a piece you've written in The Australian today. It explores the whole Black Lives Matter protests here in Australia over the weekend and how the representation of the protests in the media was telling. If it was the ABC, you say it was focused on alleged Aboriginal injustice, and if it was here on Sky News and perhaps the Murdoch papers as well, it was about the irresponsibility of the protests given COVID restrictions. But you also noted that gesture politics is a double-edged sword. And I want to quote you here, Paul. The real-world assessment is that these protests were both dangerous for public safety and dubious, highly dubious, in the benefits for Indigenous peoples. But this is the whole issue with our polity, isn't it? You know, that a lot of the media class don't want to admit that their viewpoint is highly partisan and that voters have opinions that may differ, and they treat the opinions of voters as either irrelevant or worse, as ignorant.
Well, I think that's right, Peter. I mean, the point of my column today was really arguing that we've really got a divided culture in this country, a divided political culture, and it seems to me to be getting worse and worse. And I think these protests were a very good example of this. Now, there are a lot of complexities here, but the point I would make is this. There's no doubt that the protests were for a strong moral cause, protesting against black deaths in custody. And there's no doubt that Australia needs to really lift its game on that front in the 30 years since the passage of the Royal Commission report. But having said that, the protests, given the health situation, were irresponsible because they endangered community health. And it doesn't matter how good the cause was or how moral the cause was, that doesn't exempt the fact that the protests, by their nature, were irresponsible. I think that was something more than irresponsible as well, given the entire community has responded and made a lot of sacrifices over the course of the last few months in terms of people losing their jobs, in terms of businesses closing down, people not being able to attend weddings and funerals and so on. Given the degree of community sacrifice, I think that the conspicuous thing about these protests was that people weren't prepared to share that community sacrifice, that they claim the status of being special. And the point that some politicians made to them was, well, protest, but don't protest this way. Protest in a way which is consistent with the health. And essentially the protest organisers said, well, no, we're not going to do that. We are going to claim a right for ourselves, which no other segment of the Australian community has claimed during the health crisis. I think there's a fundamental problem there, and that does raise a moral issue. The protesters were marching for a moral issue, but by marching, they, I think, infringed another moral issue, which is very relevant in this community at the moment.
Look, one of the real upsides, I think, of the last few months, and I felt for all the challenges that COVID-19 had given us as a community in Australia, well, as a society in Australia, I'll get to community in a minute, as a society in Australia, was this sense of unity and purpose and community, which is different than society, that I think had brought a lot of disparate groups together, neighbours looking out for neighbours. Gone are the days where you knew your neighbour in the same way that you might have 40 or 50 years ago. I felt that that had returned. Even I live in a suburb of Melbourne. It felt more like a small country town, my suburb, than it has in the whole time I've been here. All of that was good, but the divisions returned on Saturday. And regardless of what you think about the cause, that to me was the great sadness, that we've sort of lost that community we've built up over the last 3 or 4 months.
Well, I do think there's a lot in that. There's no doubt that the process of the National Cabinet and the working through of the National Cabinet with the Prime Minister and Premiers has been critically important. And what I'd say, Peter, is just imagine if we'd had all these decisions about health and the economy without a National Cabinet, if we'd had frontline political disputes about what to do, the whole condition of the country would be very different. And I think people don't fully appreciate the enormous significance of the National Cabinet. I think it really has changed the atmospherics and it's made things much easier in terms of these decisions. I think it's also right to highlight the sense of individual responsibility because what's happened is people are aware that there's an onus on them, that they have to self-distance, they have to take responsibility. And in a sense, when you see mutual obligation at work, other people responding, then I think it does have a bonding impact on the community. Everyone knows
it does,
that they're making sacrifices.
And that's why things have unravelled so fast, because that lack of community and purpose and unity, self-responsibility left us on the weekend. Have to leave it there, but thank you very much for your time tonight, Paul Kelly.